is difficult to look around and remember that what we see and what we touch and what we taste and what we feel is all imaginary, and what is real is what we can't see. This life is a preparation, so help us to prepare. Be with me as I teach this class today. Help us to all grow some, find something that will help us to understand and know you better. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, if you've been in my class, you know that my way I've been teaching this class has thrown some people for a loop, because we're talking about a lot of history and not a lot of Isaiah. But that's where we're going to stay. And today, if I can make this work. Could you advance me once? Hello? No, they're both back there shooting the breeze. I have no way to change this. Oh, wait a minute, let's try this. I do have this one. Nope, that one won't work either. I have a red dot. There we go. This Sunday I'd like to talk, this Sunday I'd like to talk about Damascus. If you guys have been watching the news at all, there's a lot of wars going on in the world right now. And one of them that's not getting a lot of attention is in Damascus. It's been a crazy place for a long time. The earliest reference to Damascus is in Genesis 14:15, when Abraham went and rescued his nephew Lot. You remember that story? Lot was living, Lot and Abraham had just separated and were living together. 7 kings attacked, and they carried off Lot, and they carried him all the way from, they were probably living somewhere down around here, and he carried him all the way up to Damascus. And Abraham took his hired men and his born men and his private army, basically, and then went up and brought Lot home and all of the people and all of the things that had been stolen from him in the attack. It's an ancient city leading back to at least 2,200 years before Christ. So it's about as far away from Christ in BC as we are in AD. About 5,000 years it has been there. Abraham sent his steward there to secure a wife for Isaac. And Rebecca and Jacob Rebecca sent Jacob there to get his wife. We talked last week about the Philistines a little bit, and the Philistines had settled right along here, as you can see. And when the Philistines were settling that part of Canaan, Damascus was already a thriving city. It was already growing and important. If you look carefully, you can see that there's some roads here. There's 3 or 4 of them right there. 3 or 4 of them go right straight through Damascus. Our first views of Damascus is during the city-state period. You remember that from high school history? When the cities and the states were basically the same thing. If you lived in a city, the city had a king, it had its own laws, it had its own rules, it had its own gods, it had everything it had was all the same as if you had lived in a state. It was the city-state. But as our time in the Bible comes through and we start reading about it, it was controlled first, well, actually before David's time, It was controlled by other peoples as well, but we start looking in the Bible and seeing it as an important city. David controlled it for a while, later Solomon, and then Rezon. Does anybody remember who Rezon was? He was not the voice of Rezon, I'll tell you that. Rezon was the king of Damascus, and they basically had a independent country. Depending on what version you have, depending on what map you have, you might find that country known as Aram, or as Syria. It's the same country. I've been doing some devotional reading with Samantha and sometimes Piper as well. And in one of our versions it says Aram, and another one it says Syria. They're both New American Standards, they're just different versions of it. The area basically aligned itself politically with anything that would help them reach their goals. Of course, that's like most countries were then and still are today. During the prophecy of Isaiah, which we are nominally talking about in our classes, they were aligned with Israel, and then later Judah, and then later Assyria, and then Egypt. They were also controlled at other times with other nations. Damascus is believed by some people, and lots of them are archaeologists, to be the oldest inhabited city on earth. After the city-state period and before David, it was conquered by the Hittites, then the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Medes, and then the Persians and the Greeks. That was Alexander the Great with the Greeks. Then the Seleucids, then the Ptolemies, and then Rome. That's just during what we have in our Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament both. But during that period of time, they went through that many changes. They also had periods of time when they were an independent nation, when they weren't being controlled by any of these other countries. Damascus received its wealth, like most countries, from income caused by taxes and by people passing through. But they also had a lot of people who were just on their way through. As I mentioned when I looked at that map a minute ago, there's 3 main roads going through there. And on top of that, there were also some caravan routes with camel trading. The land was also exceptionally fertile. In fact, if there wasn't a war going on right now, they were part of what was known as the breadbasket of the Middle East. Until the war in both Russia and Ukraine, Damascus and the area around was the most mined country in the world. Syria is now the second most mined country in the world. They did decide that it was possible to take care of the mines and some of the minefields by a very simple matter of driving a herd of goats across the minefield. But then you had to have some kind of feast afterwards. So it didn't work out as well. The chief god at part of this time here was Hadad or Rammon. In the Old Testament, you'll find his name is Rimmon. There was also a chief goddess, Astarte or Gartus, Artat, and the fusion of two deities responding to Phoenician Astarte or Anath. And we're going to see some other about these as well. There were other gods. There was El, Rashfel, the storm god, Ishtar, Athtart, Chemosh, and the sun goddess. And some of these gods have shown up early in some of our studies. Anybody remember any of these names or any of these gods from earlier? There's at least one that we ought to look at and say, that name looks familiar. Ishtar, why? You watched that movie Ishtar Gate, right? There really was an Ishtar Gate, and I believe it was in Nineveh, but that's not where we are with this one right here. Yes, Ishtar was also known as Astarte, and we'll talk a little bit about here in a few minutes. But any others? At least one of them we should see up there that goes, that looks an awful lot like. we should certainly recognize El. Why? Yeah. El is a generic term, a generic word. It is like the other term that we see in the Bible most frequently, Baal. That just means Lord or God. El also just means Lord or God. But we find El showing up in the Old Testament with things like Elohim. We also find it in place names like Bethel. Does anybody know what Bethel stands for? House of God. We see it in Eli and Elijah and Elisha. If you start looking around, you're going to find the El lots and lots of places. Ishtar, as we mentioned a minute ago, frequently called Astarte. She was a fertility goddess worshipped with sexual rites. You remember, if you think back, that Gideon pulled down the Astarte poles or Asherah poles that were in his father's yard at the beginning of the stories of Gideon. You may also remember Chemosh, who, along with the god Milcom, were one of those gods who demanded child worship, burnt offerings of your firstborn child. Male or female, they didn't care. It was a sacrifice. One last comment before we actually get into our study for this morning. The word Baal, you might actually take as the word sir. Sometimes when you see Baal, or you see the Bible talking about, they're talking to somebody, the first thing they say to them is Lord. They're just saying sir or mister. Any questions or comments before we get into the actual book? I know that might be a little hard to read. I just couldn't get it any bigger and still get the picture in there. Those who see you will gaze at you, they will ponder over you, saying, is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms? That's from Isaiah 14:6, which is about where we are right now. Proverbs 16, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before stumbling. So here's a question for us. Is this a promise or just a general rule? If you are haughty, proud, will you always fall? Will you always see destruction? No? Why not? Karma thing, okay? Yeah. Yes. If you are this kind of a person, you're going to be treated this way. The Bible statement, treat others like you want them to treat you, well, it comes that you actually will be treated like you treat others. If you treat others like jerks, you're going to be treated like a jerk because you're a jerk. I will rise up against them, declares the Lord of hosts. I will cut off from Babylon name and sorcerers, offspring and posterity, declares the Lord. I will also make a possession for a hedgehog, swamps of water. I will sweep it with a broom of destruction, declares the Lord of hosts. Who's that talking about? Come on, look at the verse. Or what is that talking about? Whom?
The people who are disobedient.
Read the verse again.
Let's see.
I will cut off from
Cut off from the Babylon.
what?
From Babylon.
Yeah. So who's it talking about? Babylon. Yep, yep. It's basically, if I understand correctly, what God was telling them at this time. I have given you this job and I want you to do this job, but you don't need to enjoy it. You don't need to glory in it. And you don't need to be good at it. Just do it. And both Assyria and Babylon, when they did capture the people they captured, were more than overly zealous. We've spoken about the Assyrians a couple of times in the past. One of their most famous things that they did was they would literally put fish hooks through the lips of the people and then put a chain from that fish hook to the neck of the person in front of them. And that's how they'd march them away as slaves. When they sold them, they would just rip that fish hook out and sell them. It's just, God said, you don't need to be that zealous and you don't need to enjoy what you're doing. I told you to take them captive. That doesn't mean you have to treat them like that. You know, we see that kind of stuff in prisons nowadays. The guys that end up being the guards sometimes are the guys that enjoy doing that kind of stuff. And that's a shame. Being a prison guard is an honorable position, but enjoying it and glorying in it and doing everything you can to provide punishment, that's not your job. Your job is to make sure that they don't escape. It's not to increase the punishment or make it worse for them. And that's what God was complaining about here. Okay, with that information, what do you think that is a picture of? That is a shot of Babylon. Does anybody know what the 7 wonders of the ancient world were? Or let me ask it this way. Does anybody know of a 7 wonder of the ancient world that related to Babylon? Yes. When Nebuchadnezzar was king, he was married to a lot of wives. Maybe not as many as Solomon, but a lot of wives. And several of his wives came from much more lush and beautiful areas. And he built on one of the walls of one of the cities, one of the parts of the cities, a beautiful set of gardens with flowers and trees and shrubs, and it was magnificent. When you came to Babylon, you had to see it. Babylon was built over the river, with the walls going all the way around and all the way around the river. And that was one of the reasons it was so difficult to conquer, because with that river there, they had access to water and they had access to food. So anybody that was going to besiege the city couldn't keep their water out and couldn't keep their food out. So they could basically stay in there as long as they wanted to, forever. Now, they had a huge standing army, and they were a very powerful country, so they were usually on the attack. But in the few times that they were on the defending end, they could tolerate it. The way that they were finally defeated, I fully believe it was a work of God that caused a big old flood that washed away part of that wall. So you could walk up right alongside of that river, and there was enough room for a whole army to walk in. And they walked in and conquered them. The night when God wrote a little something on a wall. Remember Meeny, Meeny, Tinkle a Parson? Anyhow, this city was conquered and beaten down so badly. Alexander the Great was famous for conquering the world. We know that. But he also was a builder. He would come across a place and he'd say, that'd be a great place for a city. And he'd build one. In the 6 years, I think it was, that he ruled, and he conquered the world, he did all that kind of stuff. And he was coming across Babylon and looked over and said, that'd be a magnificent place for a city. And somebody said, sir, that's where Babylon was. And they went and examined the place, and it was so badly destroyed and so badly torn up. And where the river had gone through, it was now just everywhere, and it was a marsh instead of a river. He gave up. He took one look and said, nope, not going to build anything here, and went on in these campaigns. Questions or comments about any of this before we go on? I don't have a lot of stuff today, so. Isaiah 16:5, a throne will be established in loving kindness, and a judge will sit on it in faithfulness, the tent of David. Moreover, he will seek justice and prompt in righteousness. I mean, this is probably a dead giveaway with the picture, but who do you think this refers to and why? What time period is this that this is referring to? Yeah, yeah, sure. We know what Jesus looks like, right? I love the fact that he looks, I'm not quite sure if that's hair or just gold trim that goes all the way down. I think it's gold trim, but still. Isaiah has more prophecies in the that are found in the New Testament than any other book in the Bible, by a long shot. I have a book at home entitled All the Messianic Prophecies in the Bible. There are a lot more than you think there were. Some of the stories where Jesus was walking with them and explaining what the Old Testament really meant to the New Testament, and he was talking to his disciples and doing that. That would be a sermon I'd like to have heard, but there are hundreds of prophecies of Christ and what was going to happen. This throne, obviously a throne is for a king. What's the kingdom? Say again? Look, love may be the ruling part of the kingdom, but what's the kingdom? The church. The church is the kingdom. Jesus Christ is our king. We are citizens of heaven because we're part of that group. We are indeed of that. Now, I got another one.
So Sam,
Yeah.
this prophecy was written by Isaiah.
Mm-hmm.
He's not talking about a throne, not the kind that people would expect to be earned by killing.
Right.
So why would the Jews at the time of Jesus have expected the kingdom to be anything but one of kindness and love and that? Why would they have expected a kingdom ruled by an iron fist or by the conqueror? Wasn't that something that they had?
Absolutely. They fully believe that this is going to be a physical kingdom with a physical king and a standing army, and we're going to rule everybody in the world. But your question is a valid question. Why would they expect that? What had they seen in the past? What had they ever seen? What kind of a rule? Oh, it is to us from this side of where it's given. Remember, this was given 750 years before Christ was born. And again, these people, I haven't got my Bible up here, I'm not going to look for it, but there's a passage in Peter that says, these prophets searched the scriptures trying to figure out what God was telling them. Because they knew that it was something important, and they have no idea what it was. That's why what I just said a minute ago about the sermons that Jesus preached with these people, that would have been magnificent, so that you could have actually been there and said, Lord, what about this passage here? Oh, that means this. Nowadays, we're looking at it and going, what does this passage here mean? We don't know. He's not here to tell us. And he was only there to tell for a short while. Dave?
Well, if you're a Jew and you live after the destruction of Babylon, gone back to Jerusalem,
Yep.
look at this and say, okay, they could have read Isaiah. Here's what God was prophesied to Isaiah. Here's how that transpired. Here's some prophecy that was going to happen. Most likely have the same mindset that this is a physical or type of thing. how God worked in that prophecy about Babylon. God would work that same way with the prophecy about the kingdom.
Yep. Does it make sense? Well, let me do it this way. Let me say, basically it's just the same thing, but when they were in Egypt, they were not looking at a spiritual kingdom. They were looking at a physical king that held them in captivity and made them do their work. When they came to the promised land, God said, I give you this land. How did they have to get the land? It was given to them, but somebody else was still living on it. So what did they have to do? You didn't just stand there and wave a wand or stand there and say, Lord, drive them out. You had to go in there with a sword and a club and drive them out. It was always physical until we get to the kingdom of Christ. It was always physical. Everything they saw, Babylon, Assyria, Rome, Greece, all of it was physical. And then all of a sudden God says, hey, there's going to be a change. And this is what the change is going to be. And they couldn't figure it out because it was so much different. Yes, yes. Many still believe that there's a physical kingdom coming. You may have heard of the people who are called premillennialists, and they believe that there is a kingdom coming. That what we've got right now is just basically a placekeeper until Jesus comes again to set up his human kingdom, and he will set up a human throne, and he will have a human army. And that's just not what it's talking about. Not at all.
But we don't know.
We do know. We do know.
Even what you're saying here is that we do know, but we actually don't do it.
About what?
This second coming of Christ, what we'll be seeing from what we read in prophecy and what we know about from the church, and how Jesus wants our lives, when he comes back, I mean, it's a mind-blowing thought, just thinking about it. Will we be in the flesh?
When he comes back, we don't know if we're going to be in the flesh or in the ground. We don't. But we do know when he comes back, we will be raised again and we'll be taken to heaven. There is not going to be any other earth anymore because it's going to be burned up. All stars, all suns, all galaxies, everything is going to be burned up with an unquenchable fire. It's going to be gone. So there's no way to have a human throne and a human army. None of that can happen. We are told that very clearly, and the people that don't see it are not looking. David?
That my kingdom is not of this earth. At that time, when he was here,
Yes.
the idea that he's never going to set up one on this earth.
The people that are saying there's a kingdom still to come have not read where Jesus said, some people sitting here today will see my kingdom. People were sitting there at the time of Jesus died long ago. No, he did not say all people were going to see the kingdom, but he just said some of these who are sitting here today will. He did that. I agree. That's correct. Yeah. Yes. Yes. And the kingdom of Christ is the church, but the second coming, the kingdom will all be brought and delivered to Christ. That's the end of it. It'll no longer be on earth. Yeah. Questions? Am I confusing it more? Yep.
The second coming is, Jesus will get you right.
Yes.
It's a wedding day.
It's absolutely what it is, a wedding day.
So we're waiting for that wedding.
Yes. That's exactly what it is. Anything else? We clear? I still don't have a lot, but I'll do what I got. This passage you're going to see showing up twice with some different stuff, but we're going to start with this one here. Now, in the day of the glory of Jacob will fade, and the fatness of the flesh will become lean, and it will be like the reaper gathering standing grain in his arm, the harvest's ears, or it will be like the gleaning ears of grain in the valley of Rephaim. Yet gleanings will be left in the olives of the topmost bough. 4 or 5 of the branches of a fruitful tree, declares the Lord of God. Look at that for a few minutes and then think, what day is this referring to? And I got a couple of options up there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 options up there. And it may be one of those. Maybe you think it's one of those. Maybe you think it's something else. But what day is he talking about? In that day, the glory of Jacob will fade. Remember who's writing. This is Isaiah, 750 years before Christ. Now, who would like to take a guess? I am fairly convinced that that's exactly what he's talking about here. As you read Isaiah, and I hope you are reading Isaiah, I'll guarantee you Isaiah is a long, hard slog. It is. But don't be afraid of it. I take, every morning I read Bible, and I read it and listen to it at the same time. I don't know if that helps me. I hope it does. But if you are reading it, and you read it through, and you read it, you will see that amongst stuff that it's talking about here, yes, there's lots of scripture talking about the second coming of Christ, but there's also lots of passages in here talking about the kingdom of Judah and saying, you are going to be destroyed and taken captive because of the way you're living, because of what you're doing right now. And I think this passage is talking about exactly that. You have been living badly, poorly, and you're going to be taken off by the Babylonians and let off. Questions, comments about this? Yes, sir.
So could this be a time before the rapture? This bringing down, let's say Babylon is a country that we know well, that we are living in. Let's say that. That's just for discussion. Could this, what you're referring to, this passage, be God's wrath taking down a civilization before the rapture?
Define rapture. What do you mean by the rapture?
Well, when he comes in the air and he takes his believers.
Yep. This is talking to Judah saying, I told you, and I told you, and I told you, and I told you, and now I'm going to punish you. You didn't do what I told you to do. Now it's time's up. Yeah. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but your use of the word rapture, I don't believe I know anywhere in the Bible where the second coming is referred to as the rapture. The premillennialists refer to it that way, and a lot of them do. But it is a term that they have co-opted to use for something that's not what it means. So when you're using that, be careful of that and be aware of that. Anything else? I got one last passage, and it's the same one, but we're going to talk about it a little bit here. I hope. Now on that day, the glory of Jacob will fade, and fatness of his flesh will become lean, and et cetera, et cetera. We just read it. When God decides to strip you of your fat and your grain and your fruit, how thoroughly are you going to be stripped? I was raised on a dairy farm in the 50s and 60s. I remember when Dad had the only threshing machine in the township, and the neighbors would come and borrow the threshing machine and thresh oats, because everybody raised oats. You had cattle, you fed them oats. It was dairy country. So I remember watching those windrows and watching the oats be cut and laid down and drying and stacking up. I don't remember what they called them anymore, but stacking up these bundles of oats together to stand them up and let them dry, and then running them through the threshing machine. I remember all of that. This talking about stripping a field. Think also of what we're seeing out in the fields today, this time of year. You drove by this field and there was corn there. It was all brown, nothing green left. And you drove by later in the day and it was nothing but flat ground and dust. That is what it's going to be like on earth when God destroys it. It's going to be all gone. Why does it have to happen? Why does it have to happen? Go on. That's true. That's true. God created this place, this earth, and all of the wonderful things we see on this earth, and He created them with a time limit, basically. We are going to be here X long, and it's going to be done. Yeah. I would hope that I would learn, and we all would learn, that the power that He has and the abilities that He have are able to do what needs to be done. There are some things that God can not do that we can do. Have you ever thought about that? God cannot lie. Can you lie? Yeah. Same. I feel the same way. God cannot sin. But an interesting one is no matter what the newspapers and magazines say, God cannot die. God can't commit suicide. He cannot die. And all men will die. And all women will die. I don't owe you an apology, but this is all I've got. If you want to visit some more, talk some more, that's fine, we'll talk. But I'm run out of what I had to say. So if you'd like to walk around and visit with somebody in the classroom, that's fine too. Thank you.